movies art? I'm not talking about film. Like, obviously Rashomon or Taxi Driver or Little Monsters are artistic works, driven by a few impassioned minds towards a singular purpose. No, I'm talking about your big-budget, committee-driven studio tentpoles, your Avengers, your Batmans, your Star Wars. Can a pie baked by 1,000 cooks still be a good pie? Can a movie engineered from the ground up by a studio still be an artistic masterpiece? I want to talk to you about The Force Awakens, but it's become virtually impossible to do so without addressing the albatross of culture around its neck. In the years since its release, The Force Awakens has been the subject of countless teardowns and critiques from sources as wide and varied as the influence of the franchise itself. But in all the hundreds of thousands of words written about it across the hours upon hours of YouTube commentary, I've come across maybe a handful of truly cogent criticisms. The Force Awakens is a movie that stands at a perplexing nexus of culture. It's the first new entry in a beloved franchise after a widely despised trilogy. It's the first new entry outside the influence of its original creator. The first within the corporate dynamo of Disney. Its director is contentious, its cast is contentious, its content is contentious. All of these things stand in the way of seeing the movie for what it is. But in a way, that's actually kind of fitting. I want to talk to you about how The Force Awakens is the first movie produced by corporate Hollywood to truly capture the shifting tectonic forces at work in the 21st century mind, the challenges of the millennial condition and the hurdles we face in confronting the cultural behemoths in whose shadows we tremble. But more than that, I want to talk to you about our culture and how all of this, the reaction, the controversy, the contention, all of it is of a piece. Luke Skywalker has gone missing. The Empire has collapsed, and in its place, the First Order seeks to retake control of the galaxy. Standing in their way is the Resistance, led by Rebellion veteran Leia Organa. She sent her best pilot, Poe Dameron, to reclaim a piece of the lost map to Luke's hiding place. Unfortunately, he is captured and tortured by the hand of the First Order, Kylo Ren. But not before sending the map off with his droid, BB-8, into the wilds of the desert planet Jakku. He escapes with the help of a stormtrooper, FN-2187, or Finn as Poe calls him, but seemingly dies in their escape attempt. Finn, wearing Poe's jacket, meets up with BB-8 in the custody of Rey, an orphan scrapper who was abandoned here as a child. When the First Order comes after them, they escape in the abandoned Millennium Falcon, and so the chase begins. Along the way, Finn and Rey meet Han Solo and Chewbacca, Leia Organa. They get lectures from Yellow Yoda. They run a lot, they hug a lot, they blow some stuff up. Finn winds up in a coma and Rey heads off to meet Luke at the original Jedi Temple. And when she arrives, you think, oh boy, what's Luke gonna say to Rey? What's Rey gonna say to Luke? It's gonna be such a great exchange. What a fantastic way to end this movie. Then they lock eyes and the camera spins and you get all anticipatory. And then it just cuts to black like an episode of Lost. Dang it, JJ! So that's the plot, but what is this movie really about? Well, how about we take a closer look at our protagonists and see if we can't suss out some clues. First, Rey. She was abandoned on Jakku as a young child, forced to become a scrapper to survive. She surrounds herself with icons of a past she's never experienced, an old rebel fighter helmet, a straw doll of a rebel fighter, and hell, she lives inside the husk of an AT-AT. She scratches every day that passes into its metal hull, waiting for her family to return to her. She's undoubtedly heard stories about Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, of the scrappy rebellion that felled the Empire despite impossible odds. As she watches starships come and go as they please, Rey fantasizes about going on her own adventures, but she believes that she has to stay here in case her family returns for her. When she does escape Jakku, she continually repeats this point.
I've got to get back to Jakku, but I have to get home.
Jakku?
I have to get back to Jakku.
Despite her clear skill and her earnest enjoyment, she doesn't think she has a part in the Resistance's story. When she finds BB-8, this same call to action that lured Luke Skywalker so many years ago, she tells him to go away. When she escapes Jakku, she wants to go back. When Han Solo offers her a job, she wants to go back. When Luke Skywalker's own lightsaber literally calls out to her, she declares, "I'm never touching that thing again," and runs off in the woods to, I guess, become a tree person. Now, Finn, he was, as he says,
taken from a family I'll never know and raised to do one thing.
We can assume he spent his entire life in simulations, being taught the party line of the First Order, brainwashed and conditioned to be a disposable soldier. But in his first battle, he witnesses another trooper killed in front of him. This person, somebody we can assume Finn has gone through training with, smears blood on his visor before he dies. Suddenly it becomes real for Finn. Whatever ideological platitudes he's been served by the First Order, this is the ultimate reality for someone in his position, dead and nameless. So he vows to escape. Some say it's hypocritical for Finn to realize the First Order is evil one moment and then kill a bunch of his fellow troopers the next, but I disagree. When Finn breaks Poe Dameron out, Poe asks him,
"Why are you helping me?"
And Finn responds,
"Because it's the right thing to do.
You need a pilot.
I need a pilot."
Right and wrong are less important to Finn than his own safety. I don't see him as someone bravely defying the First Order's immorality, at least not at first. I see him as a coward who doesn't want to die. He's a terrified man who thinks that absolutely nothing can stop the First Order and that his safest bet is to escape to the Outer Rim. In contrast to Rey's single-minded desire to return to one place so that her family can find her, Finn's only desire is to get anywhere that isn't a place, to become invisible and undiscoverable. Finn's only belief is in the absolute military power of the First Order. Like Rey, he thinks he has no place in the story of the Resistance. He considers himself an insect in the grand scheme of things, one that will inevitably be crushed unless it gets far, far away from the First Order's boot. When Poe insists on going back to Jakku for BB-8, Finn protests. When they encounter Han Solo, Finn begs him to get them as far away as possible. When presented with the possibility of going to the Resistance homeworld and actually joining the fight, he instead signs up to be an indentured servant in exchange for transportation to the Outer Rim. Finn and Rey come from wildly different backgrounds, but they have a lot in common. They were both diverted from a presumably normal life at a young age and forced into a monolithic, unexpressive culture with strict behavioral expectations. Both were raised on tales of the galactic civil war and learned of its major players not as people, but as myths.
Luke Skywalker. I thought he was a myth.
It seems to them that Luke, Han, Leia, they were born to do great things, destined to become the legends we know today. Compared to such icons, how could a lone scrapper or a scared stormtrooper ever hope to measure up? And now their counterpoint, Kylo Ren. Kyle. When we first see Kyle, he's an imposing figure dressed all in black, wearing a menacing helmet that distorts his voice and gives him a powerful presence. He's clearly a strong Force user and someone to be legitimately feared. He's also the son of Han Solo and Leia Organa and was trained by Luke Skywalker himself. We come to learn that at a young age, Ben Solo was tempted to the dark side by Supreme Leader Snoke and then murdered all his Jedi and training peers. Having proven his devotion to the dark side, Ben became the leader of the Knights of Ren, took up the name Kyle, and began doing the dirty work of the First Order. Unlike Rey and Finn, Kyle doesn't worship the heroes of the Galactic Civil War because they're his family. He knows them for the sloppy, flawed people that they actually are. Han Solo isn't the scruffy smuggler who made the Kessel Run in 14 parsecs.
12!
He's the dad who probably didn't want to have a kid in the first place. Leia isn't the princess who overcame having her home planet destroyed to lead a rebellion to victory. She's the mom who sent Kyle away to train with his Uncle Luke in what has to be the Star Wars equivalent of military school. You have to imagine that Han and Leia argued constantly and probably struggled to make time for their angsty garbage child. They have to have seen his incredible propensity for force powers and thought, oh geez, we don't know how to handle this. Let's just send him off to his Uncle Luke and see if he can straighten him out. And Luke, so damaged by the events of the war and struggling under the weight of his responsibility as the Last Jedi, was probably emotionally distant at best, not to mention splitting his attention between Kyle and all his other pupils. But there is one figure that Kyle does worship. Darth Vader. He idolizes the Sith Lord so much he had the melted remains of his helmet reclaimed from the site of his funeral pyre. In moments of doubt, Kyle even prays to Vader's likeness, saying he feels himself being tempted by the light side. The great irony of this is we as the audience know, for better or worse, that Anakin Skywalker was just a spoiled, bratty loser, and we know that as Darth Vader, he doubted his own resolve and eventually redeemed himself by killing the Emperor and saving his son. If Kyle knew just how much he actually is like Anakin, he'd probably be furious. Kyle, unlike Finn and Rey, was not forced into a rigid, limiting society at a young age. He was a child of the rebellion, a place of equality and freedom. Instead, Kyle forces himself into the strict confines of the First Order. Now, why might that be? I guess we'll never know. Wink. So here's the dichotomy. On the one side, we have two people who think they can never be as good as their idols and would rather give up than try at all. People who were given absolutely nothing and told their dreams were too big. Their best hopes for themselves are just to live normally and peacefully, and this they think is an unrealistic hope. On the other side, you have someone who was raised by a war hero and royalty, privileged with interplanetary travel and promises of big things for his future, and who still wasn't satisfied. Instead, he chose to idolize a monster and do everything in his power to become one himself, including the murder of civilians. And he believes that he's completely justified in doing this because he's the grandson of the greatest villain the galaxy has ever known. It's his legacy, his birthright. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And ultimately, this privileged, snotty, entitled little brat is overtaken by a penniless scrapper and a traitoring stormtrooper. In the intro to this video, I said that I've seen very few cogent arguments against the quality of The Force Awakens. What I mean by that is that most of the common criticisms of this movie fall into one of a couple categories. It's bad because plot holes. It's bad because remake. It's bad because casting. Almost every long-form critique covers this territory, and not only are these subjective opinions objectively and provably wrong, they also fundamentally misunderstand what The Force Awakens is actually doing. The first most obvious point is that a plot hole does not a bad movie make. Every movie has plot holes. No film is perfect. No art is perfect. So okay, there's plot holes. Why are they there? Maybe Lawrence Kasdan and J.J. Abrams actually knew there were plot holes and kept them in anyway because, well, gosh, I mean, why would anybody do that? You know, maybe it's not just a product for your consumption, but actually like an art object created with intention and meaning. Here's a common plot hole. Star Killer Base. Where does it come from? How did the First Order build it? And when? How can they have kept such a thing a secret? Yeah, it's weird, but they blow the thing up in the end, so it doesn't really matter, and really, you can kind of say the same thing about the Death Star in A New Hope, but don't you think it's interesting that this inexplicably resurgent fascist military organization would find their seat of power in a weapon that is a comically exaggerated remake of the weapon their predecessors were legendary for? Doesn't it say something about their devotion to image over practicality that they would build a supermassive weapon that eats stars for fuel when the Death Star was for sure deadly enough? And its weakness, its eventual destruction. Doesn't that say something about the ultimate fragility of military power, that a bigger gun in the hands of a tyrant never makes that tyrant stronger? Another one. Why is Rey so talented? How can she beat Kylo Ren, a trained Sith Lord, in a lightsaber fight when she's never held a lightsaber in her whole life? I don't know. How can she beat Kylo Ren in a straight fight? Here's a thought. Maybe Kyle sucks. What do we actually see him do? We see him stop a laser. That's pretty cool. We see him kill a defenseless old guy. We see him mope and whine and throw a temper tantrum. We see him deflect lasers shot at him by a woman who is terrified for her life, and then he grabs her with his force powers and then knocks her out against her will. We see him, twirl his lightsaber a couple times. And that's about it. Consider that Kyle probably killed all his fellow Jedi in training without much resistance because they were all kids who weren't expecting to be attacked by one of their own. Consider that after that, Luke is the last Jedi, so like, what else does he need? Whatever moderate training he's had up until this point is totally good enough. It's even stated explicitly that he's paused his training to be an active combatant for the First Order, and in the end, Snoke has Kyle brought to him to complete his training. Meanwhile, Rey has been fighting her entire life to stay alive, and she's done it with a stick. And when she gets her hands on Luke's lightsaber, she still treats it like a staff, favoring these ineffective and clumsy lunges. She loses ground to him. And despite the fact that Kyle has been shot in the side by Chewie, he's still defending himself. It's only when Rey centers her mind through the Force that she's able to overwhelm him. Like Obi-Wan always said to do.
Let go your conscious self and act on instinct.
Along the same lines, some are frustrated that Rey gets really good at Force stuff, despite never having a teacher. Luke had to train forever to be even remotely good at this stuff. She's just a Mary's. Okay, first, what does Rey actually do? She does a mind trick. She grabs the lightsaber. She centers her mind. These are instinctual, intuitive extensions of her needs. I think their use is justified. But hey, whatever. Okay, so let's say that it's just a thing that she should have a tutor for her Force powers to make sense. So she doesn't have a tutor. What does that say? Consider that women and people of color often don't get tutors in the real world for a multitude of reasons, either because the system, if it lets them in at all, uses them until they're dried up husks, or just outright kills them. So there's no elderly tutors to go around. Maybe Rey's lack of a tutor is a purposeful choice to say something about the struggle of clawing your way up the ladder as a minority, that it's hard, but ultimately not impossible, and maybe gives you an advantage over your competition, if you're lucky. Consider also that Rey taught herself to be a mechanic and learned the function of countless Empire ship components. She taught herself to fight and defend herself and survive alone on a desert planet. She learned how to pilot ships of all shapes and sizes, likely without guidance and on pain of death. I think she can probably figure out a way to use her brain to think a thing she heard about in a story once and make that thing happen. Also, Luke was like a derpy-ass farmer. Maybe his need for a ton of training says more about him than it does about Rey. Yeah, there's a thought. Another common refrain is that The Force Awakens retroactively robs the original trilogy's conclusion of its meaning. David Williams at Beloved Spear says, mythopoetically speaking, it's like having another battle after Ragnarok. Scott Mendelson at Forbes? Like the financial man? Whatever. He says, The Force Awakens renders the original triumph of our rebel heroes relatively meaningless, and the original arc of the first 6 films relatively pointless, if not outright detrimental to the fate of the galaxy. Yeah, that's a good point. Almost like that is the point. The original Star Wars is largely a mashup of Flash Gordon serials and World War II newsreels. Its story about a fascist empire warring with a scrappy rebellion of misfits stands as a subtle allusion to the Axis and the Allies. And just like in Star Wars, the Allies blew up the Axis and forced them to surrender. Life imitates art, am I right? And then, as we all know, I don't need to remind you of this, nothing bad ever happened again. There was never another war, the swords were beaten into plowshares, and at last we returned to the peace we knew in the Garden of Eden. Seriously? Seriously? Alright, last one, and by far the most common. The Force Awakens is a remake of A New Hope. Okay. So, pointing out that a thing looks like another thing isn't criticism. It barely qualifies as an argument. Now, is that thing that you're comparing overly reverent, thus weakening it in some way? Yeah, now we're getting somewhere. I'm sorry to dive into just basic rhetoric here, but it just isn't enough to make an observation. You have to justify why that observation is significant with evidence. So, is The Force Awakens chock full of references to A New Hope? Yeah, duh. That's the point.
I can understand that someone might say, oh, it's a complete ripoff. We inherited Star Wars. The story of history repeating itself was, I believe, an obvious and intentional thing. And the structure of meeting a character who comes from a nowhere desert and discovers that she has a power within her. Those simple tenets are, for me, by far the least important aspects of this movie. And they provide bones that were well proven long before they were used in Star Wars. What was important for me was introducing a brand new chapter, brand new characters, using relationships that were embracing the history that we know to tell a story that is new, to go backwards, to go forwards. I understand that this movie, I would argue much more than the ones that follow, needed to take a couple steps backwards into very familiar terrain, which is, again, not a brand new concept, admittedly, but use that to do, I think, a far more important thing, which introduce this young woman who's a character we have not seen before, who has a story we have not seen before.
We had to go backwards to go forwards. In other words, to set up a new story with new characters, the franchise needed to revisit familiar ground and establish a firm link to the past. It needed to understand its place in the story of the galaxy. And yeah, a safe movie is a bankable movie, sure, but don't mistake bankable synergy for outright creative bankruptcy. All right, a little thought experiment. Put yourself in JJ's shoes. You're tasked with making a sequel to Star Wars, and because you're JJ, you've basically been auditioning for this role your entire life. You don't just want to make a good Star Wars movie, though, you want to make a good movie. So what do? Well, maybe you build a story on the bones of familiar narrative strokes in an attempt to redeem the franchise, return it to its roots. But that's not enough. It can't just be Harrison Ford breaking his hip every 5 minutes. You need some young blood in there. So, what's the story of the young people in this universe? What's their struggle? How do they relate to the galactic civil war? Maybe because this is your job and you're a paid professional, you actually think about it for like a really, really long time, like months, and realize that, hey, maybe there's a connection between these Star Wars kids and another group of kids. Kids who are just coming to age in the workplace, who are struggling to find a foothold in society, who suffer imposter syndrome and everything because, all the best works have already been made. Wait a minute, is this movie about millennials? Finn, Rey, and Kyle are each introduced to us in masks. Finn, of course, is wearing a stormtrooper helmet, just one of thousands. He's a disposable worker bee, a faceless, nameless soldier expected to die unceremoniously at the whims of powerful people he'll never know. Rey is wearing goggles and rags, purely utilitarian garb to protect against the abrasive sands of Jakku. It doesn't matter to her how it looks or if it's expressive of her personality, it just matters that it lets her do her job. Kyle, on the other hand, has this precisely engineered helmet meant to embody the spirit of Darth Vader, but, even more. It's possible that he spent days or even weeks designing this thing, going through revisions, fine-tuning the voice distortion, all to craft the perfect exoskeletal mirage of a powerful, menacing, untouchable force of evil.
You're so right.
Just to hide the nerdy, lame-looking goth child underneath. Then consider their names. Rey is just Rey. We don't know if that's like her actual name or something she made up. Finn is a given name that's weeks old at this point that's based on the number he's known himself as his entire life. Neither name is rooted in history. To us, they're just sounds. Meanwhile, Kylo Ren is also Ben Solo. We don't know anything about the Knights of Ren, but just by the inclusion of that title, we get an understanding of what the name Kylo Ren stands for. And we know he's named Ben after Obi-Wan Kenobi, the tutor of both Anakin and Luke Skywalker. In every way, Finn and Rey are rootless, contextless, blank, while Kyle is someone people know by name, someone with history, someone who knows his place in the story of the galaxy.
You cannot deny the truth that is your family.
There's obviously been a lot of controversy about diversity casting in The Force Awakens from the kind of people who think Kyle is cool. But the fact that our heroes are a black man and a white woman respectively, while our antagonist is just a plain Jane vanilla white guy, is hardly coincidental to the narrative. Now, we don't know how racist or sexist the galaxy far, far away is, but we don't really have to take it as literal to get the message. The optics of a privileged white guy doing the dirty work of a neo-Nazi organization preaching peace through eugenics, while women and people of color dodge bullets and bombs from agents of that same organization? I mean, it's not exactly subtle, is it? Look at the composition of the First Order. Young, white, almost exclusively male. Everyone's tidy and neat with matching uniforms and clean shaves, regulation haircuts, and capes. Lots of capes, I guess, I don't know. When General Hux gives his big speech before blowing up the Republic planetary system, there's one black guy, right there, hiding. If there are any minorities, they're either just soldiers hidden behind masks, or they're technicians, not decision makers. For a minority to reach the level of a decision maker, they have to be utterly exceptional, like Captain Phasma here, and even her position as a decision maker is questionable. Compare that to the Resistance. What do you see here? Women, people of color, old and young, alien monsters, a variety of hairstyles, a variety of outfits. When they're planning the attack on Starkiller Base, they're in a circular room around a central holographic mapping table. Nobody here is positioned as superior or authoritative. If this random person back here had an idea, they could say it without fear of reprisals. And, if it was a good idea, they'd take it. Where the specifics of these organizations seemed vague and coincidental at the tail end of 2015, they feel downright prophetic today. The First Order, after all, is a reactionary neo-Nazi organization built on the memory of a time that was never as pure as its members think it was. The only thing they seem to stand for is order and racism. And you think, like, that can't be it, right? Can it? Oh God, it is. Ugh. They follow orders from a clean-cut, upstanding fella who probably deserves a punch, and their leader is a wrinkly, imposing old cretin who seems to have no actual hand in any of the First Order's actual workings. Snoke takes advantage of people like Ben Solo, utterly average, unextraordinary human beings who find themselves surrounded by talented individuals and think, but no, I'm special too, and who instead of putting work into making themselves better, they pledge allegiance to an ideology that tells them, no, you're special just the way you are, it's everybody else who's wrong. Then there's the #resistance, led by a career politician who's likely had as much a hand in causing the state of affairs we find ourselves in today as the First Order. They accept all comers, all under the banner of pushing back against the tide of inexplicably resurgent fascism. And yeah, the Resistance takes advantage of the kind of people who are persecuted and victimized for who or what they are, turning them into soldiers for the cause. The difference is, their service is voluntary. They're not fighting for an idea that makes them feel special. They're fighting for their very survival and for the survival of their loved ones. Kylo Ren is an entitled, snot-nosed little fop who addressed his considerable insecurities through murder and betrayal. In the Resistance, he wasn't special. He was just another member of the commune. His force powers didn't allow him to transcend his mediocrity. They just made him a Jedi in training. Then along comes Snoke telling him, no, you are special, you're powerful, you're perfect just the way you are, as you've always suspected, and I can prove it to you. All you need to do is, exactly what I command for the rest of your life forever. Rey and Finn, on the other hand, believe they have no place in the Resistance because who are they? They're not special. They're just a couple of misfit toys abandoned at the edge of the galaxy. This despite years of training Finn has gone through, the years of salvaging and researching that Rey has gone through. When they first steal the Millennium Falcon and are chased by a couple of TIE fighters, Rey engages in some inspired piloting maneuvers while Finn shoots back as best he can. After their unlikely success, they run up to each other, overjoyed, enthusiastic, both of them surprised at how good they are at this.
How did you do that?
I don't know.
No
I've
one
learned some
trained
ships, but I've never left the planet. Your last
That
ship
was
dead.
amazing.
Oh, you
You set me up for it.
Despite their relative inexperience, they show not only a knack for what they've just done, but a genuine enjoyment of it. It's possible that this is the first time in both of their lives that they're feeling this kind of euphoria of purpose. Yet despite the ingenuity and resolve we witness in the both of them throughout the movie, they still refuse to believe that they're anything special. When Rey is kidnapped just before Finn was to leave for the Outer Rim, he sees the Resistance defeat the First Order in open combat, probably the first time he's had any notion that they were beatable. And in the Resistance, despite his status as a very recently ex-stormtrooper, he's welcomed and celebrated. He's special because everybody in the Resistance is special. Everyone has something to contribute. As Kyle probes Rey's mind, Rey learns to push back. She throws Kyle's insecurities back at him. You're afraid that you'll never be as strong as Darth Vader. Having likely heard stories of Luke's force tricks, she tries one herself and figures out how to make it work. She learns to focus her mind and use her innate abilities. Rey becomes as strong in the ways of the Force as Kyle before his very eyes, because despite his years of training, he's never had a true purpose. And Rey has purpose in spades. Kyle doesn't expect to lose, he expects to get everything he wants.
That lightsaber, it belongs to me.
He's finally killed his dad, proving to himself and the world that he's really a bad boy. But it still isn't enough. But if Rey fails, Finn dies, and she's either killed herself or spends the rest of her life tortured and brainwashed by the First Order. The first adult who ever believed in her, who offered her any kind of authority or guidance, just met his end at the hands of this whiny man baby who did the murder solely because he wants to look cool for his friends. Rey has everything to lose in this fight, and in this moment, she realizes that though she might not believe in herself or her place in the galaxy, if she gives up on being more than she believes she is, she'll lose everything. And that's what this movie is about. Stepping up in the face of extreme adversity, learning to get over imposter syndrome and embrace and pursue your strengths unambiguously and without shame. Really, the only wrong answer is to believe that you're entitled to being special. And it's about this amazing thing that can happen when minorities finally take back the power they've been denied. One of the most contentious ideological battlegrounds in American discourse today is that of white privilege and the representation of minorities in our media. In this context, privilege is defined as the privilege of never having to consider one's racial, sexual, or gender standing in society. If you are a white, straight, cisgendered male, you don't have to worry about being prosecuted for the color of your skin or the shape of your secondary sex characteristics or who you're romantic with. But a black person is always aware that white people erroneously and subconsciously believe that they're naturally predisposed to violence. A trans woman can rarely just be a woman in public without fear of being outed because she knows the astronomical murder rates among trans people. When you're a cisgendered male, a compliment given by a stranger is just a compliment. But when you're a cisgendered woman, a compliment can be a threat, a proclamation of your objectification. And on any given day, you can receive so many of these that they blur together in your mind to form a haze of animosity, a cloud of constant aggression that you know you can never escape. None of this is new, of course, and it's not like minorities have only just now started writing honestly about their experiences. But what has changed, of course, is the internet. Through democratized social media, cheap and easy access to service, and widespread availability of technology, the density of information of all varieties has increased exponentially in the 21st century. More minorities are writing more of their personal accounts more frequently than at any point in human history, and their public availability from anywhere at any time gives those stories a presence they've never had. Now, a cishet white male can feel assaulted on all sides by stories of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and the reality is that the vast majority of these stories aren't overtly violent. What discrimination looks like in the 21st century isn't hate crimes, it's microaggressions. Like the example of the woman who receives 1 million catcalls a day. It can be easy to hear that story and think, wow, cry me a river. So people compliment you a lot. I wish I had that problem. But you're speaking as someone who's never had that experience, and therefore you don't know how it really feels. You don't know the pressure that it exerts on you. The implication of this newer, more complicated reality of discrimination is that everybody everybody, absolutely everybody, is a little bit racist, a little bit sexist, a little bit homophobic, including the individuals within those minority groups. Now, racist isn't a thing you are, but an unattended side effect of what you consider to be a neutral action. You no longer choose to be a bigot, you simply act in ways that have bigoted implications. Now this is, to me, a white, transgender, queer person, a truth that is perfectly reasonable to live with. But to a cishet white male who's never had to think about this stuff a day in their life, it feels like an accusation. Oh, so what? I'm just racist now? I'm a bigot by proxy and I don't have a say in it? Well, that's just BS. Because privilege is fundamentally a shielded ideological perspective, any hint of a contradicting narrative feels like a substantial attack. We know that the human brain treats oppositional opinions with the same fight or flight response as it does a physical threat. So the natural first reaction of a privileged person when confronted with the reality of their privilege is to say, "Why are you attacking me? I never did anything wrong. I'm a good person." There's an old saying that goes, the worst thing you can call a black person is the N-word. The worst thing you can call a white person is racist. A privileged person has never experienced discrimination the way a minority has. They hear these stories and naturally think, this sounds made up. Everybody's just trying to be offended these days. Or, even more common, a privileged person will respond, "Oh, so you're saying I've had it easy my whole life because I'm white? That's BS. Nobody ever gave me anything. I've scraped and bled, and I barely have anything to show for it." And you know, that might be true. I certainly haven't had an easy life. My mom died when I was 19. My dad died when I was 26. I've had crippling depression, untreated bipolar disorder, and a bad case of closeted transness for as long as I can remember. But I also recognize that for as hard as things have been for me, they could have been much worse. I can't know what trouble I avoided because of my whiteness. That is, after all, the definition of privilege. But I lose nothing to admit that it's probably a substantial amount. It doesn't diminish my personal struggle to say that I still have had an advantage in life. But you know, it is hard to hear this stuff. Microaggressions, implicit bias, what a conspiracy. Where's the proof? Where's the receipts? I demand evidence. You see hundreds of women coming forward about sexual assault and think, oh gosh, the environment is anti-male. Anybody could accuse me of assault and I'd be a pariah. You see Black Lives Matter protesters and think, well, my life matters too. You see a football player take a knee during the national anthem and think, get these politics out of my game. Isn't the time or the place. I just want to relax and enjoy something for once and not have to think. All you want is to return to a world where everything was fine. Back then, whenever that was, things were simple. Nobody talked about race back then. Nobody talked about gender back then. Everybody was too busy working a 9-to-5 and raising their white picket fences to come up with something as asinine as microaggressions. Back to a time when you knew a racist was a racist because they wore cloaks. Back to a time when black protesters were dignified and upstanding, not like today, those thugs. But of course, for women, for queer people, for people of color, back then never existed. For them, none of this is news. It's just a Monday. And when a privileged person talks about making America great again, a person of color knows what they're really talking about. And it's this ignorance on the part of the privileged population of the experiences of minorities that's at the heart of this divide, this controversy, this contention. It's the reaction of a group of people who've been told that despite their innate privilege that they just now learned that they have, you know, they've still failed to accomplish anything. It's this fear that admitting that you have bias implicitly that you can't really control somehow makes you a bad person. And nobody wants to feel a bad person. Everybody, even Nazis, think they're the good guys. It's a failure of empathy that so many people hear the stories of minorities and can't just shut up and listen, can't acknowledge their reality, can't accept it as part of their own reality, and then work to address it. because it hurts. It's not fun to think about. So I know all of this like grandiloquent soapboxing probably seems out of place in a video about a dang Star Wars movie, but I feel like I couldn't really avoid it. There were so many hot takes about how the Force Awakens cast was just diverse because, you know, they had to fill a quota, like Disney forced J.J. Abrams into not taking the white male actors who auditioned for the roles that were not written for white male actors. Fellow YouTuber H-Bomber Guy has a couple videos reacting to the incredibly rational opinions some people have about the Force Awakens.
Who is the white male audience supposed to identify with? Simple. The little white cockball.
In researching the same sort of like inspired stupidity for this video, I find I just started to feel exhausted. The vast unquantifiable majority of opinions about this movie, as I hope the rest of this video suggests, are just outright deliberate in their ignorance of artistic intentionality. They treat it like every choice from pre through post-production was made just because, like JJ and crew had a big lottery wheel that they drew random Star Wars tropes from and said, yep, that's going in the movie. Guys, they wrote this film. They spent months designing it. Disney bought the franchise for $4 billion. You think they just haphazardly threw a crew together overnight? Nothing you see on screen is accidental, so why are you treating it like, well, I was gonna say a child's drawing, but even that you wouldn't approach with the same kind of ravenous blind lust to just tear a thing apart for the sake of tearing it apart. All of this is to say, the racial element is not divorced from the rest of the story. It's all a piece of the same thing, a part of a larger whole, and its connections don't stop when the movie is over. Even critics I like seem to miss the point entirely. Seth Abramson, a brilliant journalist whose writings on metamodernism are foundational to this very series, has 2 articles on the Huffington Post that are just lists that total 60 plot holes in The Force Awakens. Now, he writes a good defense of this practice, one that I generally agree with and even made in my Game of Thrones video, that something with this kind of creative and monetary freedom shouldn't get a free pass from criticism, and that just because you like a thing doesn't mean you can't acknowledge its faults. But I also can't help but recognize that the practice of just making a list of plot holes without any real argument is both easy clickbait and kind of lazy writing. If you're noticing plot holes, it's because something is fundamentally broken in the heart of the work, and that's the thing you should really be getting at. But Seth insists over and over that he likes The Force Awakens. So what, is it purely a writing exercise? Because the average reader isn't going to take your measured stance, they're going to take it as implicit damnation. Then there's the Mr. Plinkett review of The Force Awakens, which is just... it's fine. It's kind of boring and doesn't say much and mostly just relays the debates and history around the movie while decrying its origin as a corporate cash grab, which, yeah, that's a fair series of observations. But then there's this bit that's kind of just embarrassing.
I think it's great that we have 3 new heroes that are different than the previous generations. However, in a weird way, I think Star Wars has always been kind of immune to the whole race and gender thing. Just look at these kids from the 70s. The black kid is playing with Obi-Wan, and the white kid is playing with Darth Vader. I think only us cynical adults overthink all this stuff. If you're doing this diversity shit for the kids and for them to have role models or whatever, I have a news flash for you. They don't give a shit.
Now, I could write another 15-minute long segment of this video taking apart this very good opinion, but instead I'll just do this.
When I was young, my dad always let me listen to comedy albums, and I always knew about comedy. I always loved comedy. The day that I saw Whoopi Goldberg on television, I cried so hard because I kept looking at my daddy going, oh my God, there's somebody on TV that looks like me. She looks like me.
I grew up watching the original.
Right.
And the thing that I noticed as a kid in the original was when you watch sci-fi, prior to Star Trek, there are no black people in the future.
Right.
And the first time I saw Lieutenant Uhura, it was like, oh my God, she's hot, she's gorgeous, everybody wants her, and she's in the future.
So I said, certainly, and I stand up and turn, and I'm thinking, it's a Star Trek fan. He said, it's a Star Trek fan. I'm looking for a young man who's a Star Trek fan. I turn, and instead of fan, there's this face the world knows, with this beautiful smile on it. And I remember thinking, whoever that fan is going to have to wait, because Dr. Martin Luther King, my leader, is walking toward me, not 10 feet away, with a beautiful smile on his face. And then this man says, yes, Miss Nichols, I am that fan. I am your best fan, your greatest fan. And my family are your greatest fans. As a matter of fact, this is the only show on television that my wife, Coretta, and I will allow our little children to watch, to stay up and watch.
And yet, despite my frustrations, there's something delightfully poetic about all this, isn't there? That a film about the dangers of hero worship would come out to a community of people incensed that their worshipped heroes have been slighted? That a film about race and gender politics in 21st century America would catalyze so much racist, sexist rhetoric? And the other side of it is, who can count the number of young people inspired by finally seeing themselves reflected on screen in a way that isn't diminutive or regressive? And the film's unprecedented financial success with this headlining cast undoubtedly fueled the push for more diverse films, leading to filmmakers like Ava DuVernay, Ryan Coogler, and Taika Waititi getting Disney films of their own and seemingly allowed to do whatever they want with them. I mean, look at A Wrinkle in Time, look at Black Panther. I can't speak to whether they're good films, but they're clearly coming from a place of passion, a place of drive. If these films were to fail, their directors would have everything to lose. What did Kenneth Branagh have to lose when he made Thor? And then that huge international gross that The Force Awakens brought in, it was bolstered at least partially on the back of the free advertising given it by the mob of offended commentators drawing attention to it. Angus Houveris at flickeringmyth.com, in an article asking us to finally admit that The Force Awakens is kind of terrible, wrote something that really stuck out to me. I think we need to look at The Force Awakens without the Star Wars banner that frames it. I keep coming back to this quote because I think that this idea is at the root of our cultural misunderstanding of The Force Awakens. The fact is, it's impossible to remove The Force Awakens from the context of the Star Wars franchise, in the same way that I find it impossible to remove it from the politics of identity and gender in the media and in our country. But it's not just that it's a sequel to a long-running franchise, it's that the fact that it's a sequel is of paramount importance to the story within the film. The original Star Wars films are these monolithic icons of geek culture, once upon a time the refuge for bullied underdogs. They gave birth to the blockbuster as we know it, with some help from Jaws. They started the practice of cross-media merchandising, promotional tie-ins, and you look at those films now and it's like, I mean, there's no doing that again. In the same way that there will never be another Beatles, there will never be another Star Wars, which lends to the patent absurdity of trying to do a sequel some 30 years later. So really, the only sequel you can do is one that's about that exact conflict. How do you make another Star Wars? How do you live up to the legends, the myths that are Luke and Han and Leia? How do you make characters as iconic as they are, with performances as charismatic and charming as theirs were? So, here at last we get to metamodernism. To quote myself, imagine that your grandparents are optimists and your parents are cynics. Your grandparents, in general, represent the modernists of the first half of the 20th century, whereas your parents represent, in general, the postmodernists of the second half of the 20th century. Given this, we define metamodernism as a millennial condition which oscillates back and forth between the extremes of modernism and postmodernism, of optimism and cynicism. The Force Awakens succeeds because it is, knowingly or not, about the dawn of the metamodern age, when the absoluteness of modernism and the nihilism of postmodernism have fused together in a new generation of people desperately searching for an even middle ground between the two. Our grandparents and their optimism thought the rule of law and the power of science could save us from ourselves, but they simply expedited the process of our destruction. Their children, in their cynicism, found progress solely through destruction and rebellion. They believed in a cause, but that cause inflicted wounds on them that would never heal. Though their goal was accomplished, we never get to see what difference it actually made. We only see its remnants, a world just as unequal, just as self-destructive as ever. Every new generation struggles to find its place in the world, but for us, there are two absolute truths that we are told to accept simultaneously: that everything has meaning and that nothing has meaning. We find ourselves pulled apart by a desire to find purpose and fulfillment, and a desire to maintain a cynical, objective detachment. Rey, Finn, and yes, even Kylo Ren are all avatars for the challenges we millennials face. They teach us the value in overcoming imposter syndrome and accepting your value as a human being, as well as the dangers of giving yourself up to an image of something you wish you were. For all the confidence and superiority that Kylo Ren projects, he's still just as lost and confused as Rey and Finn. But he covers it up by aligning himself to a cultish neo-Nazi regime that tells him what to think and how to feel. In place of cultivating his own unique identity, he adopts a persona of cartoonish villainy that lets him see the world without complexity. And still, we see him struggling with how unfulfilling such an exercise really is. Just like Darth Vader could never truly kill Anakin Skywalker, Kylo Ren will never be rid of Ben Solo. When you put Kyle alongside Rey and Finn, we see two sides of the same coin. A generation of people whose lives have been dictated by forces beyond their control. What options do any of them have in life? Could Rey go off to be a successful middle manager at a Fortune 500 company on Tatooine? Could Finn take up improv and eventually become the host of a late night show? We don't get a sense that there are any careers in this world, any semblance of a middle-class life. For the average person, the options are either to languish in obscure poverty at the ends of the galaxy or become militant resistors in a war for survival. Either they can change the world, or they can't change anything. So what do you do? What do you believe in? Is there an objective, qualitative meaning, a force of light to align yourself with that will guide you on the right path? Or is it all just relative? Just organisms in your blood vibrating with the energy of the universe, the light and the dark, a mere coincidence of society? Do you follow the cause that you believe is right? Or do you follow the cause that gives you purpose? Do you rail against the changing tides of our time? Or do you let them sweep you away to unknown shores? I don't know that The Force Awakens has many answers. It is, after all, a big, committee-driven blockbuster sequel. One of the fundamental traits of the metamodern condition is in the asking of questions without an immediate need to arrive at a conclusion, and The Force Awakens brings up quite a few questions, which is why I chose it as the first example of how our changing ideological landscape is reflected in our media. The Force Awakens is like a metamodernism sampler platter, a quick introduction to a number of ideas without getting too far into the weeds with any of them. But I think it ultimately comes out in favor of the minorities in their quest to take back power, affirming the inevitable victory that will come with overcoming one's own psychological holdups. How much you identify with that conclusion depends a lot on what you believe, and whether that conclusion is realistic is a question we'll be addressing in a future video. So, I don't know if it's art. I don't know if the resonance this film has with me is coincidence or by design. Regardless, it's meaty enough that it took me over 40 minutes to get through to the heart of the thing. But these questions are just the beginning, and if we really wish to resolve them, we have to turn to other media for answers. What is our place in this fragmented world? Why do we lust for objective explanations in our art? How do we connect with each other? How do we engage with our media? How do we learn to embrace or even celebrate our differences? And how do we accept the impact that history has on our daily lives? All these questions and more will be addressed as we continue our expedition down the rabbit hole of the 21st century in our quest to understand this, the metamodern age. See you next time. Hey, thanks for watching. Special thanks go to my $10 a month patrons, Amy Mims, Austin McCauley, and Logan McQuiston. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, maybe consider supporting me at Patreon at patreon.com/LTAS. Just $5 a month gets you access to my notes and scripts, which for this particular project will be a very substantial amount of material, as well as outtakes and other unused footage. I also have a podcast about what it means to be transgender called the Trans Questioning Podcast, and you should check that out. You can find me on Twitter at HMSNoFun. The music of this video is by Insane in the Rain. Links in the description. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.